cultural life of Russia in the X7th century continued to develop more intensively than in the 16th century. This was facilitated by the expansion of international and cultural ties between Russia and other countries. In Moscow, the first educational institutions are created, the Slavic Greek-Latin Academy. To this, there were no properly organized schools in Russia. Literacy was taught to the deacons at the churches and in the houses of wealthy people. All education was reduced to memorizing several church books. The disciples chanted repeating what the teacher had said. Therefore, the folk proverb said, "The alphabet is taught," they screamed throughout the whole house. For the slightest mistake, the disciples were severely punished, often whipped with rods. The rods were even sung in verse. In the X7th century, a significant number of translated and original Russian works appeared. A brief survey of Russian history, Synopsis, was written, which for more than a century later served as a training book on Russian history. At the end of the X7th century, Remizov S. put Siberian history. The first printed ABCs appeared. A large number of foreign works on history, military art, medicine, mathematics, geography, natural sciences and other sciences were translated into Russian. In the appeared literary Russian writings, the nobility and merchant life was described. By the second half of the X7th century, includes a significant number of small satirical stories. They ridiculed drunken priests, greedy judges, bribe takers, noble knaves, etc. This literature tried to convey the truth of life. It, in contrast to church literature, was secular and realistic. The same approximation to life is observed in the development of Russian painting. Artists began to strive for a more accurate transfer of reality to liveliness. In the Parson portraits tried to achieve similarity to the original. The talented Moscow artist Simon Ushakov set as an example the properties of a mirror, which exactly reproduces the real world. The same Ushakov wished for painting. In the X7th century, Russian architecture has developed extensively. Remarkable monuments are famous for the plans and reproductions of the palace of Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich in Kolomenskoye, the royal chambers in the Trinity Lavra, etc. By the X7th century, is the flowering of jewelry production, preserved in a variety of valuable dishes and book bindings, as well as the flourishing of the skill of carving wood. However, the overall cultural state of the country lagged behind other European states. This is explained by the extremely unfavorable conditions for the cultural development of the feudal serf system. Capitalist economy was already developing in the countries of Western Europe, and the heavy consequences of ruinous wars that the Russian people were compelled to maintain in order to defend their independence. Not only among the local population and the provincial nobility, but among the highest feudal nobility there were many uneducated and even illiterate people. In a particularly difficult situation were women and girls. In boyar, noble and merchant houses the girls grew up in total solitude before marriage. They did not dare to seem like an outsider and did not see strangers themselves. The whole day the girls went through embroidery and prayers. Parents arranged marriages for their children without asking their consent. The bride and groom did not usually see each other until the wedding. No better was the situation of a married woman who turned into a submissive slave to her husband and could do nothing without his permission. Literacy among women was a rare occurrence. The clothes of the well-to-do population were heavy and uncomfortable. The outer clothing was lowered below the knees, and the sleeves almost touched the ground. Therefore they gathered on their hands in numerous folds. In such clothes it was difficult even to walk quickly. Sometimes, wishing to boast of wealth, they received guests in the rooms in luxurious fur coats. The ceremonial clothes, sewn from expensive cloth or East silk fabric, sparkled with precious stones, pearls and huge gold and silver buttons. Noble people wore very tall, slightly expanded upward fur hats, called thrody. During the ceremonial exit the boyar wore even 3 hats, a flat one, a tuff, a cap and a throaty one. The hair on her head was low. The beard was the main concern. If the beard did not grow, then such a person was considered capable of bad deeds. Advanced Russian people understood the harmful effects of backwardness, especially in engineering and in military affairs. The closest associate of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich Boyar Afanasy Lavrentievich or Dinashchokin was an ardent supporter of reforms based not only on his own Russian experience, but also on the best achievements of other nations. In the X7th century, Russian trips abroad have become more frequent. Moscow noblemen often went to embassies in England, Germany, France, Turkey and other European and Eastern countries. There were attempts on the part of Russian trade people to travel with goods to European cities, but these attempts were not successful, since foreign merchants, fearing competition, did not allow Russian trade in their countries. The Moscow government, in need of knowledgeable people, invited foreigners, experts in military affairs, doctors and other specialists to its service. Not all foreigners were useful people. Many of them turned out to be deceivers who came to Russia only for gain or for espionage. In Moscow itself at the end of the XVI century, there was a whole settlement, inhabited by foreigners. Subsequently, it began to be called the German suburb. In the middle of the X7th century, she was beyond the river Yaouza, near the village of Preobrazhensky. Familiarization with foreign, especially with Western European culture, led to the gradual penetration of its elements into the everyday life of the wealthy classes of the Russian population, the nobility and merchants. In the rich houses there were objects of foreign origin: paintings, maps, musical instruments, books, dishes, ornaments, etc. Cultural ties between Russia and Ukraine and Belorussia included in it were significantly strengthened. Kiev began to work in Kiev icon painters, carvers and other masters. Boyars were invited to their homes, Ukrainian teachers and mentors. The educated Belarusian monk Simeon Polotsky was a teacher in the family of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. In addition, he composed comedies, wrote poems and taught Muscovite oratory. Under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, a comedy troupe was composed of Russian students, which gave performances on historical themes. Subsequently, a special room was set up for the theater, in which plays were also written by the Russians. During the performance, the king sat on a special bench in front of the stage, and the invited boyars stood. The queen watched the performance from the box, closed by a lattice partition. Cultural shifts in the X7th century touched only the upper strata of the ruling class. The masses remained ignorant and dark. The peasants lived in cottages drowned in black, without a chimney. Smoke exited through a single small window. Ignorance of the population was used by priests, healers and sorceresses who were treated with conspiracies, holy water, and various herbs. Therefore, mortality, especially among children, was very high. During the epidemics, entire cities and counties died out. Despite the need and serf bondage, folk art has not faded. Wanderers, wickets sang epics and historical songs, in which it was told about outstanding events, about the struggle against the Tatar yoke and about popular uprisings. The observability and wit of the Russian man were manifested in numerous popular sayings and jokes. Folk jugglers buffoons played small scenes in which priests and boyars were often ridiculed. The church tried in every possible way to drown out folk art, forbade music and street performances. Patriarch Nikon even ordered the collection and burning of folk musical instruments. 62. Moscow is the capital. In the X7th century, Moscow was a large and crowded city. Foreigners compared it with the largest cities in Western Europe. The middle of Moscow was occupied by the Kremlin, which was the administrative center of the state. In the Kremlin there was a royal palace, consisting of many separate buildings. Near the palace there were farm buildings, barns, cellars, barns, stables, etc. Not far from the palace stood a large stone building of orders, which faced the Ivanovskaya Square. From the porch of this building to the assembled people, various orders of the Tsar and the boyars were announced. They were beaten with whips or sticks, sent to punishments near the orders. The memory of this was preserved in the folk proverb, "Screaming all over Ivanovskaya." In the Kremlin there were courts of boyars, clergy and some large merchants. Moscow grew up, spread in all directions from the Kremlin. As it grew, the estates of the princes and boyars surrounding Moscow, their villages and settlements, populated by artisans and serfs, were connected with the city. The memory of the once meadows and villages in the city has long been preserved in the name of Moscow's streets and squares. The place Kudrinskaya Square, now the area of the uprising, once occupied the village of Kudrino. The street Polyanka ran through the area where there was a clean field earlier. The Red Square adjoining the Kremlin was formed at the end of the XV century, on the site of burned buildings. Therefore, it was long called Fire. It was used for bazaar trade and executions. From the middle of the X7th century, this area became known as Krasnaya, probably because it became the largest and most beautiful square in Moscow. Several times Moscow was renovated with new fortress walls. In the 30s of the XVI century, the wall of the China City was attached to the Kremlin. At the end of the XVI century, the Russian master Fyodor Kony built the walls of the White City. In the reign of Boris Godunov, the buildings behind the White City were surrounded by a wooden wall with high towers. The wooden wall was burned during the uprising against the Poles in the spring of 1611. Then a big earth wall was erected in its place. Chinatown was a commercial center of Moscow. Most of it was occupied by rows, consisting of small shops, closely 220 standing one beside the other. In each row, traded with one single commodity: meat, fish, iron, cloth, silk, lace and other objects. The largest trade was in the living room yards, in which the visiting merchants, guests stayed from different countries. In the White City there were many rich noblemen and merchants. Large boyar yards resembled country estates. In the spacious barns and cellars stored stocks of products brought from the villages. In the cramped backyard buildings there were hundreds of slaves who made up the boyar courtyard. Artisans and trading people lived in special settlements. There were suburbs belonging to the Tsar, individual boyars and monasteries. We lived in Kudysyovo Sloboda, weavers who made a canvas for the palace. In Kuznetsk, blacksmiths. In Bronnaya, masters who made helmets and chain mail. In other suburbs, artisans of other specialties. The houses of poor people were no different from village huts. In places the buildings stood close to each other, in places there were unsettled wastelands or green pastures for cattle. In the narrow, crooked streets, two carriages often could not part. In some streets, individual houses were pushed forward and obstructed the passage. In the X7th century, in connection with the development of domestic trade, Moscow's economic importance has grown even more. The importance of Moscow as a cultural and national center of the country was no less significant. The Russian people loved their ancient capital, which was associated with many historical memories of the heroic struggle against foreign invaders. Chapter XX: The Peoples of Siberia in the X7th century. 63. Eastern Siberia in the X7th century. Peoples of Eastern Siberia. The Russian state annexed in the X7th century almost all of eastern Siberia from the Yenisei to the Sea of Okhotsk. The vast territory was inhabited by various nationalities who were at various stages of social and economic development. To the east of the Yenisei to the Okhotsk coast lived tribes of Evenks, or Tungus, as they were called by the Russians. They lived in large clans, between which there were often bloody clashes. In winter, the Evenks hunted in the Siberian taiga, and in the summer they gathered on the rivers for fishing. The Evenks were inhabited by portable plague, that is, tents covered in summer with birch bark, and in winter with skins. Evenks used tame reindeer for transportation of people and luggage. Even Key's ironware was taken from neighbors, but there were few such Evenks. Some tribes in the course had armor made of bone plates. The Evenks dressed in colorful clothes, loved bright and shiny decorations, and tattooed their faces. Even Ki were very militant, and their neighbors feared. Great influence was used among the Evenk shamans, that is, sorcerers. Evenks believed that shamans can summon spirits. For this, the shamans dressed in special outfits and performed a wild dance, accompanying it with blows to the sacred tambourine. To the south of the Evenks, on the upper reaches of the Yenisei Kyrgyz have long lived. The Chinese called them in ancient times Kakas. Therefore, the peoples living along the upper course of the Yenisei, we call Kakas. The Kyrgyz were cattle breeders and roamed in the peninsula of the steppes. From neighboring forest peoples, the Kyrgyz princes gathered a tribute to furs. In the inaccessible gorges of Altai lived various tribes of the Highlanders. Some of these tribes knew how to melt iron and make weapons and other things from it. Neighboring nations bought such products or took them forcibly in the form of tribute. The Altai peoples became part of the Oirat possessions, one of the Mongol tribes. In the center of the territory occupied by the Evenks, the Yakuts lived along the middle course of the Lena River. Culturally, Yakut in the X7th century stood above the peoples around them. Yakuts were engaged in breeding cattle and horses, which was facilitated by the abundance of beautiful meadows on the middle reaches of the Lena River. The Yakuts lived in wooden houses heated by hearths. They knew how to handle metals in a primitive way. Their weapons, knives planted on poles and especially armor were appreciated even by Russians. Yakuts have a clan system in the 17th century, already disintegrated. Of the mass of the Yakuts, princes, owners of large herds, were distinguished. In the service of these princes, besides slaves, there were free Yakuts, poor people who did not have their livestock or had it in insufficient quantity. On the tributary of the Yenisei, Angara, on Lake Baikal and in the upper reaches of the Lena inhabited the Buryat Mongol tribes. The main occupation of the Buryats was cattle breeding, but they also had small-scale farming. They even exchanged barley and millet for furs and other goods. Ancillary occupation was hunting. At the head of the Buryat tribes stood the princes. On the Amur River lived the Ur and related tribes. At the level in the X7th century was already a high culture. They lived settled in the villages, engaged in farming, sowed various cereals and bred various vegetables and fruit trees. They had many cattle. From China they were brought home chickens. Along with farming and cattle breeding, hunting for fur-bearing animals was of some importance for the Uri, especially for sables, which were very numerous in their land. The wealth of the Amur region attracted the neighboring Chinese feudal lords. They forced the inhabitants of the Amur region to pay tribute to them with sable skins. Every year, tribute collectors from China came to the Amur, and together with them, Chinese merchants with goods. From the Chinese, the Urs acquired silk materials and metals. Under the influence of the Chinese, the Urs began to build good houses with windows covered with thin paper instead of glass, and began to dress according to the Chinese pattern. The Ur were well-fortified cities. At the mouth of the Amur lived Nivki, or Gilyaki. Their main occupation was fishing. The peoples who lived in the northeast of Siberia, Ostolas, or Yukachirs, Nymilans, or Koryaks, Chukchi, Idelman, or Kamchadals were still at a very low level of culture. They did not know iron and used instead of stone and bone. They shot arrows with stone tips, used stone knives. Iron they learned only from the Russians, so in their tales they called Russians Iron People. 64. Eastern Siberia and its colonization. Russian advance to the east. Eastern Siberia was conquered by Siberian servicemen, that is, Cossacks and other military men who served in Siberian cities. On their own initiative, they were sent by small detachments to conquer non-peaceful Earth. In addition to collecting the royal yasak, they took a lot of furs for themselves and profited from the sale of slaves captured prisoners. In the conquered tribes, They took in the Ammonites, hostages of the elders and princes, in the conquered lands. They built small houses, that is, small wooden fortresses. Siberian industrialists were assisted by industrialists, hunters, who from year to year increasingly came to catch sables. In pursuit of sable, hunters penetrated into the most remote corners of Siberia, sometimes before servants came there. The parties of the Cossacks and industrialists went deeper and farther to the east, into unknown lands. This way, over the course of several decades, the whole of eastern Siberia was joined from the Yenisei to the Sea of Okhotsk. On the eastern shores of the Obskaya Bay there was a land that the Russians called Mangazaya. In an effort to restore their independence, the Khakhtan kings sought help from the Moscow kings. In 1586, an agreement was concluded between Moscow and Kakheti, according to which Khakhtan Tsars recognized themselves as vassals of the Moscow Tsar. However, the Russian state could not provide military support to its allies because of the distance range. The situation of Georgia was all the more difficult because the struggle between Turkey and Persia did not cease because of certain parts of Transcaucasia. In 1614, Kitiya became a victim of an invasion by the Persian Shah Abbas. The country was subjected to unprecedented in its cruelty devastation. Over 150,000 Georgians were resettled in Persia. Khakhtan Tsar Timiraz was forced to return to Moscow, where Mikhail Fedorovich reigned at the time. Under Alexei Mikhailovich, Timiraz himself came to Moscow to obtain assistance, and was received with great respect. However, this time too, he could not get help. Granted to their own forces, the Georgians courageously waged an unequal struggle against cruel enemies. In this struggle, they put forward a number of remarkable folk heroes. Georgy Sakadze belongs to them, who gave all his life and outstanding abilities to serve his homeland. George Sakadze tried to stop internal strife between the feudal lords, weakened the country and prevented the successful resistance of the conquerors. For his services in the People's Liberation War, he received the honorary title of Great Muravai, Great Ruler. The invasions of the Turks and Persians led the Transcaucasia to utter ruin. Azerbaijan was captured by the Persians in the early 16th century. Then he became the prey of the Turks, then the Persians, which had a disastrous effect on the population. The once flourishing cities of Transcaucasia, Tbilisi and Kutaisi, are deserted. Particularly difficult was the position of the peasants. Georgian and Armenian landowners, in order to preserve their possessions, converted to Islam and thereby bought support from Turkish and Persian feudal lords. A very large number of peasants were completely deprived of their land and turned into slaves, the so-called bought serfs. Kartliski King Rostam, protege of the Persian Shah, in the middle of the X7th century, by agreement with the feudal lords confirmed that the peasants had no right to leave the land of their masters. The feudal lords sought to subjugate even the mountain communities, which until then retained their freedom. However, the brave Highlanders, Khazars and some communities of Free Swania, were able to defend their independence. Thus, Georgian, Armenian and Azerbaijani peasants suffered from double oppression, their own and foreign feudal lords. Long experience of the struggle of the Georgian people with the Persians and Turks showed that, despite courageous resistance, feudal fragmented Georgia was not able to withstand numerous hordes of enemies. Therefore, already in the X7th century, it was clear that for Georgia joining to Russia was a lesser evil in comparison with the threatened fate under the rule of Turkey and Persia. 66. Central Asia in the X7 centuries. In Central Asia at the beginning of the XVI century, there were two large Uzbek states, Bukhara and Khiva. Their population consisted of Turkmens, Tajiks and Uzbeks. Turkmens roamed with herds of cattle between the Caspian Sea and the Amudarya River. The main occupation of the Tajiks was agriculture, which was especially successful in the fertile irrigated areas. In cities, Tajiks were engaged in craft and trade. The Uzbeks, in their mass, were nomadic cattle breeders, but in part they were already settled. At the end of the XVI century, Karakalpaks appeared in the lower reaches of the Sirdari River, which used to roam to the north of the Aral Sea. The descendants of the Uzbek conqueror Shaybani were established in the Bukhara Khanate. In Khiva, the independent dynasty of the Uzbek Khans rules. Both states were divided into a large number of small principalities, ruled by relatives of the Khan. The dominant layer consisted of a tribal nobility, Beks, which gradually concentrated in its hands extensive land holdings. The Bukhara state greatly intensified in the late 16th century, under Abdul Khan, who destroyed almost all his relatives and annexed their lands to their possessions. With the strengthening of his rule, Abdullah Khan relied on the support of the Muslim clergy. At the end of the XVI century, the dynasty of descendants of Shaybani in Bukhara stopped. With the new dynasty, power passed to the tribal nobility. The Uzbek Beks, formerly Khan's governors, turned into independent rulers. Therefore, the territory of both Bukhara and Khiva was divided into small independent possessions. With the development of a settled feudal economy, the former tribal nobility turned into large landowners and subordinated to them the population living in their possessions. Increased feudal oppression caused repeated popular uprisings. Large Central Asian cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Khiva and others in the X7th century, had a large handicraft and trade population. Caravan trade linked these cities to the markets of China, India and Russia. The cities were enriched by a number of beautiful buildings. Good buildings were built for schools, madrasas, especially in Samarkand. The brilliant poet Alisher Navoiy, died in 1501, became the founder of the Uzbek national literature. His writings were carefully rewritten and served as models for imitation. To the north of the Uzbek Khanates are vast steppe spaces from the river. The Urals to Lake Balkhash were occupied by Kazakhs, who, after the departure of the Uzbeks in the early 16th century, to the south, to the central part of Central Asia, separated into a separate nationality. The development of feudal relations led to the disintegration of the Kazakh Khanate into Juz state, the senior in the eastern part of Kazakhstan, the younger north of the Aral Sea and west to the Ural River and the middle. However, despite the political disintegration of the Kazakh Khanate, the economic and cultural ties between the Juz were not interrupted. The population of the whole of Kazakhstan spoke the same language and was aware of its belonging to one people, Kazakh. In the X7th century, the economic ties of Central Asia with the Russian state began to grow stronger. From Central Asia through Astrakhan to Russia were exported cotton and silk fabrics and various jewelry. From Russia, furs, walrus bones, metal and wooden utensils and other items were brought.